today we're going to go over the single arm braced high row, as well as the single arm seated low cable row. If that sounds confusing, don't worry, it is. But it shouldn't be confusing whenever you see the application. So I'm gonna try and differentiate that really quick, make it pretty seamless, easy to understand, so you know exactly what these two movements are and also like the different use cases between them. So I will start here with the single arm braced high row. All right, so the difference here is immediately apparent. You have this bench set up as your bracing apparatus. And you're gonna be using a cable that's set up at a slightly downward angle. So as you get yourself set, put knee on the bench, just like if you're gonna be performing a single arm dumbbell row, you're gonna be using that off arm to support yourself, again, just as if you were doing a single arm dumbbell row. You're gonna have this off leg out to the side to make sure that you have a stable base. You're gonna kick your hips back to create somewhat of a downward, almost like pull down motion. And you're gonna pull with your elbow, aiming almost for your hip here. And if you get it right, you should really feel your lats contracting. And the benefit here is that you really can tinker with your setup and also your execution. So if you're not feeling it the way that you want to be feeling it, you can rotate your hips a little bit, you can kick that foot out a little bit, you can move the bench back a little bit, you can drop the cable as well. There's a lot of things that you can do to really ensure that you're feeling it in the right spot. And again, this is a very lat-based movement. You should be feeling it in your lats. You need to drop your torso angle a little just to make it more of like that hybrid pull down type of movement. So that single arm braced high cable row. Again, it's a mouthful, I know. Now we're gonna move on to the single arm seated low cable row. Most people are gonna be pretty familiar with this. So this is gonna be done on a traditional seated low row bench. If you're gonna do single arm, I would highly recommend that you're performing it on a hinging pulley system. This one is actually pretty fixed, but some of them do pivot a little, and that's actually much better for single arm movements because you're not going to be pulling the cable off of its track. And whenever you pull it off of your track, it's gonna create a lot more friction. So again, make sure that the cable is perfectly lined up with that wheel and that pulley if it's not actually going to be pivoting. But here, you're gonna set up, you're gonna row in just as if you're performing an unbraced dumbbell row. And if you have a good eye, you should already be able to see the difference here from the braced high row. And the difference is going to be in mechanics. So whereas the braced high row was much more of a hybrid pull down and the angle was almost vertical, the seated low row has a tendency to be almost more of a hybrid horizontal to upright row. A lot of people tend to lean pretty far back whenever they're performing this movement, rather than if we were performing or mimicking the braced high row over there, we would actually have to be much more bent over at the hips. So what happens there is instead of getting a lot more lat, you're gonna get a lot more mid-back and even rear delt because of that subtle change in torso angle and rowing mechanics. It's not a bad thing, but you just need to know exactly what you're getting out of the movement. Braced high cable row, much more lat. Also, much more modifiable in the movement pattern, how you're actually executing it, setting it up. Single arm seated low cable row, much more mid-back, much more rear delt, but you can actually go a lot heavier typically with a movement like this because you're not going to be nearly as confined as you are with a single arm braced high row, unless you can get really lucky and find a really dope cable system for that movement. So with this, again, very similar movement patterns. They look almost identical unless you have a really, trained eye to be able to spot those differences. But applying them to a program could have pretty vast implications for how you actually use the movements. Lats, mid-back, make sure you get those right before you implement them in your program.